Welcome to Wisdom Unlocked, The Ways of God, a production of Lionshare, a ministry that aims to co-mission with Jesus in making disciples of all nations. We ignite and provide resources to disciple makers in the church and throughout the vocations. In our world today, there is more information available than at any time in history, but wisdom is in short supply. In this podcast, you'll hear how learning about the character and ways of God is a guide to wisdom.
Hi, I'm Sonia Bierson. I'm joined by Dave Buehring, the founder and president of Lionshare, and we are kicking off season 2 of our podcast. This is episode 1. Very exciting, Dave. We've got 1 season under our belt.
It is awesome, and now season 2, and I'm looking forward to the topic that we're talking about in this season.
Yeah, this season we're going to be talking about work, vocation, our calling, and what that has to do with disciple making. And this is going to coincide with the release of your new book, The Great Opportunity, Making Disciples of Jesus in Every Vocation. And, you know, people might hear the title of our podcast, Wisdom Unlocked, The Ways of God, and they may wonder, what does this have to do with our work, our vocation, our calling, and disciple making?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. And I'm glad that people would wonder about that, because oftentimes what we do is we compartmentalize and we put our spiritual lives in one category and our work life in another. And I don't think that's a good reflection of how the scriptures speak about God in his ways. And when we talk about the ways of God, we mean how God goes about doing things. And so when we consider God's ways related to our work, it means how are we to both reflect and reproduce God in and through our lives in our work world, in our attitudes. A big one is how we relate to people, in our competencies, in our commitment to work, all those kinds of things. So the ways of God have often been left out of the work world. And I think, Sonia, we want to talk about how we can maybe take a different approach and different look at that.
Yeah, I think when I first met you, I talked to you about how, you know, there was this divide between what was considered secular and what was considered sacred work. Mm-hmm. So, you know, my parents were missionaries, or are missionaries,
yes,
and they also worked. They both had their own jobs that they did during the week. But in addition to doing that, they pastored a church, they held Bible studies, you know, that was their additional work. Mm-hmm. And when I decided not to go on the mission field, not to work for a parachurch organization or even to, you know, go on church staff, it was kind of a head scratcher for some of the people that I was involved with. Mm-hmm. And what I said to them was, you know, I think God has opened some opportunities for me. Some doors have been opened for me to go into the world of journalism, mm-hmm. in which I think my work pleases him. I reflect him in what I do. But at the same time, it's a place where not only can I reflect him, but perhaps even, you know, I think mission field is kind of a strong word, but there's a lot of unchurched people, a lot of people who don't know about God, have never met someone who tries to reflect him in their daily life. And so we've had a lot of discussions about this secular versus sacred mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And for me as a young guy, where that began to get framed for me was graduating from high school. I was planning to go into that same field that Sonia has been so good at, journalism, was accepted at the University of Minnesota, was ready to jump into that. But I took a little gap year and I went to Youth with a Mission, which is the YWAM. Some of you are familiar with that organization. It's the largest missions organization in the world. Well, my gap year turned into a gap 7 years. And during that time, I was very challenged in the things of growing in my own walk with God, and with it, my worldview and how I saw the world around me. And one of the key influences that came from that was through a man by the name of Loren Cunningham. Now, Loren is the founder of YWAM. And during that particular time, him and Bill Bright, who is the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, or today it's known as Cru, had a conversation together in the mid-70s. And during that time, they discovered that both of them had been hearing some things from the Lord about how important it was to look at society through the lens of spheres, or we might call them vocations. And for them, they chatted and they found out the same 7 were on the radar, and those were family, church, government, education, media, arts, entertainment, sports, and business. And so they begin to have a dialogue about that. Well, it began to infect both of their organizations. And I joined Youth of the Mission in 1977 right after that. So it became a very big part of my own thinking.
Yeah, I've heard that term, sphere of influence, when I was in college and even after that. And I like that phrase. It basically talks not just about your personal life, the people you may have influence with, but it also includes your work life. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoy that phrase. I was really influenced by Bob Briner's book, Roaring Lamps.
Yes.
That talked a lot about how, Christians need to also work in professions that affect culture, that impact culture.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about the biblical basis for this, because obviously these are not just great ideas or thoughts or theories on the part of these folks. There's a biblical basis for it.
Yes, there really is. And I think oftentimes what we do is, again, we compartmentalize. This is my Jesus walk, my times with the Lord, being in church or a small group, and then here's my work world. And yet when we look at the scriptures, Psalm 24:1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it." So all parts of what we would call of society actually are rooted in God himself. Now, let me give you another passage that I like. John chapter 1, verse 3. It says, "All things were made through him." Notice, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So when we think about construction and we think about culinary schools and the delicious meals that we can have, and we think about awesome educators, and we go on and on with the vocations, one of the things we need to realize is God didn't just create the role of shepherds for flocks, churches, and missionaries and Christian school teachers. It's a very, very limited view that way, and that doesn't really reflect God's heart nor his creation very well.
Yeah, flash forward, 30, 40 years from that initial conversation, by Loren Cunningham and Bill Bright and Francis Schaeffer and others. I do think that people are at the point, believers are at the point where they understand that their faith should inform their work. Mm-hmm. But I think what you're asking people to do is something beyond that. And what is that thing?
Yes, I think oftentimes we have conversations about being salt and light in our work worlds. And that is something we absolutely should do. And there are so many fantastic resources and books and seminars and things out there that people can listen to and learn from about that. But what we oftentimes see lacking is the dynamic of actually reproducing disciples of Jesus within our vocations. And what I mean by that is this. You're going to find in your workspace that there are other people who also love Jesus. But if they haven't, let me say it this way, if they haven't had the opportunity to grow spiritually, you can provide them with that opportunity, not only so that their personal lives and their relationships and their families and all that are healthy and a little bit more spiritually strong, but you can also begin to take a look at how can we, through our vocations, better and bless the world around us? How can we advance God's kingdom? And this does not mean I'm wearing my I Love Jesus t-shirt to work. That's not what I mean at all. But what I do mean is there's more intentionality, and we call that disciple making.
That word seems very intimidating, right? We think of Jesus's disciples. So when we think about the ultimate disciple maker, we think of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, people that I've approached and said, "Hey, would you disciple me?" they are kind of like, I'm not that great. I'm not Jesus. I haven't figured this out. So I don't think I have the capacity to disciple you. And these were not necessarily people in my particular office, right? That it wasn't, in the case of some of our friends who work in medicine, it wasn't necessarily someone in their hospital or on their staff.
Right.
It could be folks who share that particular vocational field, that maybe they're in church with, or maybe a friend introduced them to. They're a little further along the road in their journey of being a believer, working in that field, and they understand some of the challenges that you could face when you're working in that field.
Yes, exactly. And so, you might be somebody who works in the field of technology, for example, and you may know that God has specifically led you there. You know that your wiring and how you're made fits with that. That's all part of the divine dynamic of vocation. And in the midst of all of that, you may find that there's nobody that you're kind of doing the 9 to 5 with who is in that category. However, just as Sonia said, when you're at your church or when you're in your neighborhood, you may find other people around you who are in that same vocation, but have never had the opportunity of growing spiritually for their own lives, but also as it references what that looks like in one's vocation.
So I hear you using the word vocation, and I've used it too because I've been hanging around you. And I think some people might be confused why you're using the word vocation when usually we talk about work, whether it's at an office or on a construction site, or, even as a mom or dad within our own household. Why are you using the word vocation? Because when I hear the word vocation, I think it means a priest or a missionary, or somebody who, works as a pastor. Those are things that I think when I think of vocation.
Yeah, and I have found over the years that, sometimes that word is swapped for work or occupation or employment, and for others it means exactly like what you just described. And what we're meaning by vocation is it's the connecting of a sense of calling on your life, meaning you've been uniquely made to do certain things that I can't do that you're fantastic at. God has uniquely made you to do that. And so vocation, which is actually, it comes out of a Latin word, vocatio, and it's where we get the word vocation from. And so it's our work combined or married to the dynamic of factoring in things like God's calling or leading on our lives. Now, that could be something where we hear something somehow, some way from God. It might be through a person or through the Bible or our own reflection, but it's equally taking an honest look at how He has wired you. In other words, there's certain abilities that you have. There's natural abilities that ever since you were a child have always been there. And there's lists of these things, everything from you've always related good to people, or you're the person that could take the Legos and build them the best, or you're extremely organized, or there's athletic or music talents that just have been laden in there since you were little. Then there's acquired skills, which would be things that you've learned along the way. And again, a wise parent who sees musical skills in their child will then give them acquired skills through piano lessons or drum lessons, or in one person's family, cello lessons, And so you see these things and you try to enhance them. That's acquired skills. And then there's also spiritual gifts. And the Bible lists these in several places in the scriptures. And they're everything from mercy to serving to leadership to teaching to all kinds of different expressions of gifts. And so when you think about your wiring and you think about calling, it's realizing, okay, God has uniquely made me to do certain things. And the sad thing for me, Sonia, is I still see the numbers really high, somewhere around 80, 85% of people who are doing the 9 to 5 or the 50 to 60 hours a week of work are not fulfilled in what they're doing. They're doing it really to be paid. They're doing it so they can be responsible and get their bills covered, but they're not taking joy in every day going to work. And oftentimes it's because the marriage of how you're wired and God's calling on your life, and your work really is not where it can be. And so when we say vocation, it's the beauty of all those things combined.
Yeah, I think, if to give people a shorthand, of when we use the word vocation, vocational field, you may even hear us saying vocational calling. It is a combination of our work, our calling, and, our family responsibilities and social interactions. And, Martin Luther had a lot to say about this, right? I love the quote where he says, God himself is milking the cows through the vocation of the milkmaid, right? What more mundane task can you think of than sitting there and milking a cow? But he's saying God himself is milking the cows through the vocation of the milkmaid. When I was a stay-at-home mom, I remember reading Practicing the Presence of God. And there was a story in there in which he is literally mopping the floor. And as he mops the floor, he's saying, I'm doing this to serve my God, right? Even in this thing that I'm doing that is mundane, I'm going to do it as doing it unto the Lord. And for me as a stay-at-home mom, that was so encouraging because, all you're doing is repetitive things that get all messed up again, like within a couple of hours, right?
Yeah.
So thinking that was actually vocational work made it feel more significant to me. Talk to me a little bit about why Martin Luther had so much to say about this and why reading him can help us understand this idea of vocation.
Yeah, and I think, Martin Luther, there's a lot of different opinions on things he said and things he done. And like all of us, we run on mixed fuel. And so there are some things that Luther has said that I think on this topic are very significant, where on other things, people may have other opinions on that. But one of my favorite quotes on this too, Sonia, is this one. Luther said this: the idea that service to God should have only to do with church altar, singing, reading, sacrifice, and the like is without doubt the worst trick of the devil. How could the devil have led us more effectively astray than by the narrow conception that service to God takes place only in church and by works done therein? The whole world could abound with the services to the Lord, not only in churches, but also in home, kitchen, workshop, and field. And somehow we have over the years bought in to a mentality that's very opposite this. And I think the thing that should be exciting to us is when we get up to get ready to go to work for the day, whether it is, again, being the stay-home mom or the stay-home dad, or you're heading off to a different location, or you're working out of your home, whatever that looks like, that we recognize that there's something very special and unique, something meaningful that we can contribute to society that God has wired within us. And I love to encourage people to find that and to go after that. And I know that might mean rethinking life. I know it might mean the change of jobs. But can I tell you, God has his hand on your life. He's made you very uniquely to be a blessing to many. And that many might be your family, it might be your neighborhood, it might be your nation. That's up to God in our obedience to him. But I just want to encourage you in that today. You have been made very special by God. You have a unique wiring. Combine that with what he's asking you to do and watch yourself flourish.
And I think that's the same for both people who are believers and for non-believers, right? There is this search for significance. There's a wiring in the human soul. There's that hole in us that wants to search for that significance. And so if we're doing something that doesn't line up exactly with our gifts or our desires or the things that we know we could be good at, or, maybe right now what we're doing isn't fulfilling our desperate need, we feel empty. We feel like, Lord, why am I not doing something that's more significant? And I know one of the things you've talked to me about is seasons, right? Seasons of life. And I think that idea of seasons has become a little bit cliche, but talk to me about why seasons are so important.
So that's a great question, Sonia. And in our new book, The Great Opportunity, we actually dedicate a chapter to some of this. And it's on a polished arrow is what we call it, and how God made Isaiah a polished arrow. In Isaiah's life, we see his encounter with the Lord, which you would call seeing God. And then there's a shaping by God. And then there's a sending by God. And the piece that you're referring to is that middle ground shaping. And unfortunately, I've run into way too many people who actually have some kind of encounter with God in their own life. And I'm just using that generally to say seeing God. And then they run right away to sending, and they skip the whole shaping process. And there are seasons of our life that God uses to develop us. When I have the privilege of walking alongside 20 and 30 somethings, they'll often hear me say, while you're in your 20s and 30s, it's more about what God is building in you than what he's doing through you. Now, that doesn't mean that God can't do great things through you, because when you obey what he asks you to do, he can do that. But it's where you're focusing. And God's trying to build things into your life. And as you get older, those things that he builds inside of you begin to come out more forcefully, more expressively, and you start seeing more and more fruit for God's kingdom. So along with understanding our vocation, it really is important to begin to understand the seasons of our lives so that we can best cooperate with what God wants to do, not only in us, but through us.
All right, we're going to take a quick break right now. I want you all to hear a special offer that has to do with this new book, and we'll be right back.
Here's a special offer for podcast listeners. When you purchase The Great Opportunity, Making Disciples of Jesus in Every Vocation at lionshare.org, enter the discount code Podcast Bundle, all one word. You'll receive an additional book by Dave Buehring called The Jesus Blueprint. Learn why and how to disciple someone else who works in your field. Go to lionshare.org today. Remember, buy The Great Opportunity and enter the discount code Podcast Bundle, all one word, to receive your free book.
Dave, we started talking in this podcast about Bill Bright and Loren Cunningham and Francis Schaeffer coming together around the same time along these ideas of the 7 spheres of influence. And as you have studied this topic and spoken about this topic, you've actually added a few others to that, given what things look like in the world today. So tell us, what are some of the other fields? What were the fields that you first talked about, and then talk to us about the other ones that you think need to be added to this?
Yes, and I think the way that we look at it at Lionshare is these are vocational umbrellas where so many things are tucked underneath these, and they're not meant to be in cement, but they're categories that help us be able to encourage people. And so the original 7 that I learned as an 18-year-old was family, church, government, education, media, arts, entertainment, and sports, and business. And then just through my years of friendship and relationship and even pastoring, you run into people who do all kinds of things. And I think where society has gone over time, there's some additional ones that we look at. One is science and technology. And so, obviously that has exploded in the last 20 or 30 years, and many people's professions, their occupations, their work tie into that. We have health, medicine, and wholeness, which deals with everything from doctors to fitness and eating well to counseling, all that kind of area. Health, medicine, wholeness. Agriculture, environment, zoology is another one. There are people that deal with things of creation. And we have to have a scriptural point of view on that. And those people can help lead us in that. Then there's also the nonprofit service organization sector. It's amazing, Sonia. It's like 1 out of every 3 or so people are engaged with a nonprofit or service organization. That's a whole nother realm there where people give their lives to and express their gifts through. And then the last one we've just referred to as peoples, meaning actual people, because there are people groupings in the world. For example, in our city where we live here in the Franklin area, which is part of the Nashville metroplex here, the reality is we have many Kurds outside of Iraq and New York, there's more Kurds that live here in Nashville than anywhere else. Well, that's a people grouping where they have a unique culture, they have unique understandings and language and preferences. And there are some people whose calling is to a unique people group. So those are kind of a dozen vocations and expressions that we look at when we talk about these things.
Dave, there might be some folks who are listening to this who say, well, I still feel skeptical that my job or jobs that I know of could be a calling. How could a janitor have a calling?
Mm-hmm.
How could a radiologist be a vocation?
Mm-hmm.
How could, ministering to African Americans, right? Really listening to some of their issues. How could that be a calling? The guy who flips burgers at McDonald's, I don't think that's a calling. It's not something that where, you can reflect God or disciple someone. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I say that you're asking a great question, and it's something that you want to not take lightly, and you want to dig a little bit deeper inside of your own life. So, there was an old movie that was out called Chariots of Fire, where you see the story of Eric Liddell, who is an Olympic runner. And if you remember the story, if you haven't watched the movie, it's a great movie to watch. But he did not run on Sundays. And it was something he did because he didn't want to compromise running on the Sabbath. That was part of his belief. But he was also somebody who was faithful to what God gave him as gifts to steward those things really well. And he won. He was a success. And it gave him the ability to share his story with many, many other people. And I think when we look at our vocations, we have to not just look at position. We can't just look at success. We can't just look at finances. We have to look at the people's lives that are impacted from what we do. And that janitor in the school who loves Jesus may be the only person who every day before school starts or after school's out, depending on how they do their work, that goes into every single classroom to clean. And could you imagine a godly man, a godly woman serving in that role who prays over every single seat, every single classroom? Don't you think that might make a difference? Or the person in radiology who has to help someone understand what's going on inside of them that they don't understand themselves. That understanding that they can pass on, the encouragement, the context that they give that can be life-giving to someone. We could go on and on and on. There is no vocation that in and of itself cannot be used for God's glory. Now, I'm not talking about areas of sin. I'm just talking about vocations where we can serve God, we can serve other people. So, Sonia, to people who are thinking like that, I first want to affirm it's a great question. I also want to say, if your day-to-day job is not a vocation for you, I want to encourage you to pause. Ask the Lord if there's anything he wants to say to you, because his dream for you is to fulfill the purposes for which you've been born, to better and bless the lives of people, and that his name will be glorified.
And I want to give a little bit of a plug. If this is interesting to you, if this topic is something that's resonating with you, that's what this whole season is going to be about. Next week, we're going to, in 2 weeks, our next episode, we're going to be talking about disciple making. Because people say, well, I don't want to evangelize on the job. That's not something I want to do. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about making disciples in our vocational field. And so we're going to define some of those terms. Some people like the idea of mentoring or coaching, and we're going to talk about some of the differences there. We're going to talk about a little bit more about that topic of why being salt and light is not enough. We're going to talk about how each job is rooted in the character of God. And maybe you haven't looked at your job or your child's job or other jobs you hear about in the news. Maybe you've never looked at it that way. And that can be something that touches you and helps you reframe what you do. We're going to talk about spiritual warfare in the workplace. And again, as we're talking about all these things, we'll be referencing this new book, The Great Opportunity, Making Disciples of Jesus in Every Vocation, which you can pick up, which will go into these things in depth and perhaps will inspire you to seek out someone who can go through this with you, who shares your vocational field, or maybe you will seek out and pray to God about who you might disciple using this book to have discussions about what does it look like to reflect God on the job? What does it look like to better and bless society as you're going? So we hope this season will be something that really helps you understand to reframe what it is you do and what it is that Jesus wants you to do through your work. And, I just want to end with this note, Dave. God invented work, right? This was actually the first job he gave was to Adam and Eve. And we tend to look at work as something, not that great, right? It's a constraint on our life. It's something we have to do, but we don't want to do it. And actually God created it, and he didn't create it in the way that maybe we see the toil and labor of it. So we'll discuss that in a future episode, but that's something for you all to chew on as well, is that God created work. And so it's another expression of him in our lives. Anything you want to end with, Dave?
I love this topic. I think it's an important topic. I think God really wants to see us as the church, capital C, really engaging in this, because it not only impacts our personal lives, our families, but our communities and even our nation. So I think there's some good things coming, and we hope you come back and join us.
Sounds great. And you can pre-order Dave's book, The Great Opportunity, and just go to lionshare.org and you can pre-order that book, and we'll be getting it to you in October. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Wisdom Unlocked: The Ways of God is a production of Lionshare, a ministry that ignites and provides resources to disciple makers in the church and throughout the vocations. To learn more about what we do and how we can help you, please visit lionshare.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Vimeo.